I can promise you two things. One, that it will be certainly worth it. We will have an excellent panel discussion, as mentioned, focusing on the challenges for European security and defense policy. And the second promise that I can give you is that we will end on time, so that we will have not only some time for questions and answers as well, but also enough time for the lunch break. While my colleagues are quickly rearranging the setup for this panel discussion, let me start with introducing our panelists for the next session in the order of the appearance of their presentation and introductory remarks. We will first be joined by Major General Johann Frank, Director Cabinet of the EU Military Committee. He was prior the head of the Institute for Peacekeeping and Conflict Management at the National Defense Academy and Director for Security Policy at the Austrian Ministry of Defense. Mr. Frank, thank you very much for joining us. We will then be having the honor to hear an introductory remark as well from Mr. Sven Biscop. He is the Director for Europe in the World Program at Egmont, Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, and we have also the honor to call him our AIES Senior Associate. Sven, please also join us at the panel discussion. And then, last but most certainly not least, we have the honor to be joined today by Mr. Vladimir Milov. He was previously, in the early 2000s, the Deputy Minister for Energy in Russia, has ever since been also a writer, author, and outspoken critic of the Russian leadership and the more authoritarian stance that we have also, of course, now in detail heard in the last panel discussion. Mr. Milov, please also join us for the discussion, for the debate at the panel. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over directly to you, Major Colonel Frank, for your presentation. I know that you have prepared a couple of slides for us that we can go ahead now. Thank you very much for presenting your input to us.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's good to be back in Vienna from Brussels. Thank you to all of the organizing institutions for once again giving the EU Military Committee a voice and to give some insights on the, I would call it, the military end-user perspective of what we have discussed this morning. Of course, it's a challenge after this already very dense and intensive discussion not to duplicate what already have been said, so I will adopt my presentation accordingly and start by trying to take together what have been discussed this morning. So all those strategic challenges which have been mentioned from China, Ukraine, Russia, not so much Africa, maybe we should focus a little bit more in our panel on Africa as well. Not mentioned the possible revival of the Islamistic terrorism threat also to Europe. Of course, this is an enormous package of challenges and risks and threats. And I think, as has been already analyzed by the predecessors, is these challenges will not go away anytime soon. Not go away anytime soon. So neither the war in Ukraine will really come to a settled peace agreement very soon, nor, of course, the strategic competition with China will end, nor the different crises and conflicts in Africa. There is a pessimistic scenario, and now even the Middle East is in a grave turmoil again. So we could also summarize this. We are in a longer period of time, in a longer phase of transition of world order, and nobody, I think, of us will know what will be the result of this transition process. When I personally started with dealing with European security and defense issues, so roughly 20 years ago, then there was this first famous line in the then European security strategy around 2003, I think, Sven, it was, that never in its history Europe was so free, stable and secure and so prosperous. So this was 20 years ago. And now when we took over our new office in Brussels with the new chairman of the EU Military Committee, my boss, General Brieger, who also conveys his best greetings to this group here. One of the first sentences by the High Representative of Foreign Policy, our boss, Josep Borrell, was, General, look, Europe is at danger. What can we do? Well, so Europe, from never so stable, so secure, so prosperous, to Europe is at danger. So, and this in quite a short period of time. Yeah, so the good news, I think, it's providing a little bit the Brussels internal view, is that there is a certain momentum of having recognized this strategic change, this change of the strategic landscape, that we are no longer living in the same world as we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think this is very important, because everything starts with the mental change, with recognizing what is going on, what is the difference. Yeah? I think as a consequence of this, there is now a new momentum also on security, but also on defense. So we see clearly a new momentum. And we see, and I will explain it in then a little bit detail, not too detailed, don't worry, the step-by-step, the incremental approach, progress we are making. To summarize more or less what we are doing now currently these days, we are doubling the resources and the capacities which we had in the past. So more or less, I will go into detail. So this is the good news. So we are making incremental, step-by-step progress based on the recognition that we are no longer living in the same world order as before. But the bad news is, of course, that, as President Fasland, of course, has mentioned, it always starts with political will. Yeah? You have to articulate your political will, you formulate your interests. But then, based on this political will, you have to build structures. You have to build capacities, and when it comes to military structures and military capacities, this does not happen overnight. This does not happen within 1, 2, or 3 years. This at least takes a decade or longer. At least a decade or longer. So as we had more than 20 years, much more than 20 years of this famous peace dividend, so this cannot compensate it within 2 or 3 years. And it's not only a question of money. It's not only a question, I would even say, not primarily a question of money. Yeah? So money is available if there is the will to spend it. But it's a question of structural constraints. So just one example, when it comes to supporting Ukraine with ammunition, the overall and the political defined goal is to provide 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter rounds for Ukraine. And even the money is here, yeah? But we are really struggling in Europe to develop the defense industrial capacity to produce this amount of shells. Yeah? And this is not only for Europe, yeah? This is also the case for the United States, for example. So there, and this is open source information, capacity for producing this type of ammunition is now currently 28,000 per month. And their intention is to increase it up to 100,000 per year. Yeah? So then taking this amount and compare it with the goal to provide 1 million of ammunition, and this is just one small element in the whole, but it's a picture, but I think it's a very representative one. So I see there is now a strategic window of opportunity, yeah? And this maybe or hopefully will last until the end of this decade. So it will be this period of the political leadership in Brussels, including the next one. They have to make the decisions, they have to provide the strategic important guidance, yeah, and then the implementation has to follow. And my assessment is, but it's my personal one, is that we have until the end of this decade in order to be better prepared and to transform what I mentioned, this step-by-step progress which we make into sustainable long-term development. Yeah? And this is exactly what is now about. So we need now to have contracts, yeah, with the defense industry, which gives them the guarantees for future investments. We have now to provide the long-term strategic goals with regard to our personal numbers, etc., with regard to our missions operations, in order then to develop this long-term strategy. So this was in very general aspects, so I will now be trying to adopt my presentation accordingly. The question is, as all of you who are since a longer term dealing with European security and defense issue, the question is, we tried it several times, is it different this time? And why should it be different this time? So I already explained, I sense there is a new momentum on defense, but there are remaining structural challenges, and I will touch upon them briefly. And we come from a phase where CSDP, Common Security Defense Policy, was a policy of choice. Yeah, was nice to have, it would have been good if we would have had it, to a policy of really strategic necessity if Europe wants to avoid to become a quantité négligeable in the world. The driving factors for this have been already mentioned. I would just highlight two aspects which have not been, I think, mentioned during our morning discussion. One driving factor is also the United States, yeah? But not, of course, as an active threat against Europe, but since Obama, the United States have clearly in their concept defined that it is no longer their ambition to fight two major wars at the same time. This is no longer their ambition. So if something happens in and around Taiwan, for example, yeah, then at the same time they would not have the capacity and the capabilities to defend Europe at the same time. Yeah? So this should, for us, be also a driver for getting our act together, and not only the already direct mentioned risks. And second, also indirect aspect for doing more together is also my assessment, but I think Sven could elaborate a little bit on this also, because he has extensively written on this issue. I personally think that also the NATO force goals, yeah, which currently is to provide 300,000 soldiers within 30 days. This is a big ambition. Yeah. We'll see if this can be managed. Yeah. But I think from the military perspective, this NATO force goal can only be achieved if the Europeans form multinational European force packages. Yeah. Otherwise, on a purely national basis, even the NATO ambition cannot be achieved, yeah? Especially when it comes to strategic enablers, core-sized forces, etc. This goes beyond what European nations can do alone. This requires multinational European force integration and cooperation. So it's not a question of either NATO or EU, but it's about, as we have heard in the first opening speech, it's about a strong European pillar within the transatlantic alliance, which is able to act also autonomously if this is necessary. Yeah, I mentioned these structural challenges which we have to deal with in Brussels nearly on a day-to-day basis, without, of course, being able to solve them, but we have to manage them. Just some keywords. We have good common European ambitions, high ambitions, and we have concepts, but the red line on the opposite column shows that the implementation of this concept lies mainly within the nations. Yeah? So we have European concepts, yeah, which have to be implemented on the national level. No? This has, of course, to be balanced. We have seen, I've already mentioned it, 3 decades, a historic phase of underinvestment, and the strategic recovery time will be at least for this 10 years. We see step-by-step progresses with regard to CSDP, but at the same time, the speed of the external pressure, of the external challenges is enormous. Yeah? So the question is, do we have enough time? Yeah? How do we deal with this shrinking of the available time? We have the ambition to strengthen the European defense industrial base, but at the same time, European armies want to buy and have to buy now and today. Yeah? So they are going, for example, to other continents, to other countries, like, for example, South Korea, yeah? Which have a very, very capable defense industry and instruments available. We have new instruments on the EU level, so the peace facility, the defense fund, PESCO, all these famous acronyms. Yeah? We have these instruments, this is good, yeah? But we did not really make the full use of it. So there's more potential to use these already existing instruments. We see with regard to our military missions and operations a quantitative rise of what we are doing as a contribution to international peace and security based on the comprehensive approach, of course. But at the same time, we have to critically ask ourselves if we are delivering the effective results with what we are doing with our missions and operations, especially when it comes, for example, to what we are doing in Africa. We have, with regard to capabilities, we have persisting military shortfalls. Yeah, this is since many, many years. We all know this, from strategic transport to strategic communication, etc. So it's a long list, very well known. But at the same time, I have to say, we have most of them available, but on the national level. And I'm sure, so to give just an assessment from my point of view, that we could cover at least 90% of the shortfalls if member states, if the capitals would be willing to provide them also for the European Union. Then we have, of course, an impressive record on support for Ukraine. I will give you some figures on this, but at the same time, we have already heard the question, are we really in a position to safeguard a long-term support against the depletion of our stocks, and this is has already taken place to a high degree. We have discussed this with the 27 shots 2 weeks ago in Spain, and they really raised their concern about the status of what they have available in their stocks. Of course, I will not go into detail, yeah? But this is of course expectations. Yeah? So what we did for Ukraine, yeah, at very short notice, which was really unprecedented with regard what the European Union has done in the past when it comes to military support for other countries, also have caused or have expectations in other countries, for example in Africa. They tell us, okay, why can you deliver at short notice? Yeah? Weapons, lethal equipment, yeah? Training at a high qualitative level. Why can you do not the same for us here? So it's always what you're doing is creating expectations on the other hand as well. So yeah, these are the challenges which the chairman of the EU Military Committee has to, on a day-to-day basis, take into account. What is his role? He is, of course, the highest military advisor within the European Union. And what we are doing is our main job is giving unfettered military advice. Yeah? So we can do this upon a request or upon our own initiative. And what we see in the last, or we have seen in the last 1.5 years, that the broad of the spectrum of issues where we should give advice is broadening nearly every month. Yeah? So in the past, we only had capabilities and missions operations. Now we are speaking in the military committee about space, yeah? About artificial intelligence, yeah? About China, etc. So really the spectrum where we should give advice is broadening at a very, very high speed. And of course, the expertise which we need in order to do so has to cope with this demand. Of course, the military committee is giving strategic direction to all military CSDP relevant issues, and we have to build consensus amongst the 27. And you can imagine this is not an easy task to do so, especially when the end result should not only be a formal consensus, but a substantial consensus. Yeah? And of course, the chairman is also communicating military CSDP. I don't know how many in the room were aware of this first ever military exercise in Spain, which took place 3 weeks ago. It was the first ever EU-led, led by Brussels headquarter exercise with around 3,000 soldiers. Austria participated, as General Streetinger has mentioned. How many of you have heard about this exercise? 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Yeah. So, but what I mean is, what I mean in this context, for me, this is a good example that we must really become much better in communicating what we are doing. Yeah? I think a very broad audience, part of the population, even does not know that the military committee is existing, that an Austrian officer is chairing it. What are they doing? Yeah, so etc. So, and this is, for example, another big difference to NATO. Yeah? There are many differences. Also, I have already explained that we were working closely hand in hand. Yeah? But they have a very, very effective public diplomacy department. Yeah? And so I think when it comes, for example, with regard to Ukraine, many of you would think in the first place of NATO, that NATO is the most important supporter for Ukraine. Yeah? But in fact, if you look at the figures, the first security provider for Ukraine is by far the European Union and the European Union member states. I will provide you with the figures. Yeah, and this is my last slide, and the rest I will skip in order for leaving room for discussion, is what are our current priorities, what are we really working on? I would say these are 4 priorities. The first and the most important is the establishment of the so-called RDC, this Rapid Deployment Capacity. This is the key project of the Strategic Compass, and it is our firm intention that General Brieger will declare full operational capability of this force by beginning of 2025, meaning by the end of our term. So we are doing the best in order to make this happen. What is this RDC? This is you can see it on the slide, this is a modular, scalable, joint, meaning maritime, air, land, autonomous rapid reaction force led by an EU headquarter. No? We are not allowed to call it a headquarter, so it's called MPCC, Military Planning Contact Capability, so it's another tricky issue, but more or less it's that. It's a capability that the European Union can also command and control this force, and this is as it said, it's modular, but it's around, the strength is around 5,000 soldiers. So this means more or less in the core of this battle group remain the RDC remain the battle groups. They remain the core, yeah, but the battle groups have around 2,500 plus minus. Every battle group is a little different, so it's more or less a doubling of the size. Yeah. So we need the military C2 structure, so the headquarter for commanding and controlling this force. This requires to increase the manning of the headquarter from currently 60 staff officers to 115 by next year. And I hope on Monday there will be the manning conference, that we will be there and have these soldiers, these staff officers available. And I really think it must be doable. If I compare this figure, 115 for an EU HQ with, for example, the NATO HQ. They have for various HQ elements. They have overall around 20,000. Yeah, depends on what you count, and they increase now by 2,000. So it should really be possible to come to this 115, and this is also a question of credibility. This element will be installed in a new building. They will, by the beginning of next year, change to a complete new building, and of course they also need, besides the infrastructure, an up-to-date communication and information system. This RDC is prepared for 5 scenarios. What should they be capable to do? They should be capable to do evacuation operation, like we have seen, for example, in Afghanistan. They should be able to do a stabilization operation, the first phase, the initial phase of a stabilization operation. They should be able to conduct a disaster relief operation, to conduct conflict prevention, and a peace enforcement as the most robust scenario. And if you look at these 5 scenarios, they are so realistic. They are so realistic. That is not the question that if one of these things, one of these scenarios will happen, it will be only the question of when it will happen. And then it's the only question, do we at this time can provide the political leadership of the European Union and military capability in order to react in such a situation or not? This is as simple as that. We already started a new cycle of exercises, so this RDC for the first time will be trained and will conduct exercises on an annual basis. So what we did in Spain was just the beginning. This will be continued under the next presidency, so there will every year be at least one exercise. So this was our first priority, this RDC, and what is it about? The second is, of course, continuing the support for Ukraine. I have already said a lot. We started with military training and equipment. So far, the European Union has spent more than 5 billion euro as European Union, so as collective body under this European Peace Facility instrument, and additionally 20 billion on a bilateral level, only for, so meaning 25 billion euros only for military support. Yeah? And this, and the overall support, so meaning the rest of economic, etc. support, sums up to 83 billion. So, and for the next period, for 2024 to 2027, the recommendation of HR Borrell is to get an envelope of further 20 billion for the next, sorry. So I can continue. Yeah. So for the next 3 years, further 20 billion for military support. Yeah. So, but we are not there yet. We are not there yet. This recommendation needs to be needs an unanimous political decision by the heads of states of government at latest by December. Otherwise, we cannot continue with our plans. We have so far, in a special training mission, trained 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers in more than 500 different training modules throughout Europe. And the goal for the next period is to raise the number to 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And out of the 1 million rounds of ammunition, we have so far provided 300,000. So, and if you compare this with all other actors, yeah, you see this is the fact where we can safely say that the European Union is the first security provider for Ukraine. If it is enough, yeah, this is a different thing. Yeah. We have received a very, very detailed list what the Ukrainians would need. This was the question of President Faslam before. Yeah, we have it, yeah, but I think it's an uphill struggle to tackle all those requirements. Yeah, missions and operations, I will be very short here. We have currently 4 training missions, 2 assistance and partnership missions, and 3 military operations, meaning with executive mandates. Just one sentence is Where we are currently struggling is with regard to our military engagement in Africa, because we need a clear political definition of the objectives of the strategy, what goals should be achieved with our military presence in Africa. So currently, the main goal with our missions in Mali, Niger, as in this Western Sahel region, is to show strategic patience, to hope for the better, that the political circumstances on the ground after the coups will change, to remain a footprint, but there is no clear political guidance. So President von der Leyen has asked for a strategic review of EU's engagement in Africa, and this will, of course, have an impact on our military engagement there. Just last sentence in this regard, we definitely cannot abandon Africa, like we have abandoned Afghanistan, for example. So Africa is our immediate neighbor, and everything what happens there will have sooner or later an impact on European Union. We already mentioned terrorism, but also especially, of course, the migration and other things. But Africa, of course, is not only a continent of conflicts. There's also a lot of hope and positive signs. But I will stop here in order to give other presenters their possibilities to present and then have an interaction with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Major General Frank, for these very clear statements and for your very professional remarks, especially drawing the picture of not only the fact that we're living at the age of transition, of shifting towards more disorder in a global but also European regional scale, but also that positive momentum that you have mentioned for enhanced security and defense policy within the European Union, also as mentioning your priorities here. If you wouldn't have engaged now also the audience into the developments on the African continent, I would probably have asked that as a question, but we can elaborate a little bit more on that probably in the discussion. But first I'd like to give the floor to Sven Biscop. Sven, one of your priorities in your teaching and in your lectures, if I remember correctly, is also that you're focusing on the grand strategy of the European Union and, of course, other regional and global powers. And therefore, based on also what we've heard already from Major General Frank, I would be interested probably in hearing, does Europe and the European Union indeed have a grand strategy? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here again at the Europa Forum. Thank you, Werner, Minister Vasselabend, for asking me back. Johann and I did not coordinate, but indeed it's a very similar message. And I was going to talk about 3 tasks for CSDP as I see them, and maybe I do that and I briefly end on the grand strategy question. Number 1, I will be very brief, is support for Ukraine. What I would add is that I think would be a prudent assumption on the part of Europe that whatever happens in US domestic politics, US military support for Ukraine will diminish. Gradually so if the Democrats stay in power, but potentially drastically if the Republicans gain power. So we have to prepare to compensate, which means that we not only must sustain what we have been doing, we must increase the effort. And as you said, Johann, we're not even sure yet, member states have not yet accepted the proposal for the 20 billion for the next 4 years, but that's sustaining what we have been doing, but probably more will be necessary. And we are already late, and what does surprise me, and I think it came out in the presentation by the Colonel Reis earlier, we still do not have a real long-term plan on how to support Ukraine. We still move very incrementally, weapon system by weapon system, small number by small number, and whereas I think by now, a year and a half into this war, we should have come up as Europeans with a plan that say for the next 5 or even 10 years, which armed forces will Ukraine need, which capabilities do we require, how will we produce it, pay for it, and transfer it to them. And that is on us now, I think, and I think the EU is well equipped to do that. I think, however this war ends, or maybe does not end, Ukraine will always need substantial military support, even if by an act of magic there would be a peace agreement this afternoon. That would be a fragile peace. Nobody would necessarily trust Mr. Putin's signature. So even in that scenario, you still need a strong conventional Ukrainian force as a deterrent. So whatever happens, this must be done, and only we as Europeans can do it. That's the first task that I see. The second task is indeed related to our expeditionary role. And I think now it's very clear for a moment in the first, let's say, half year of the Ukraine war, all the attention, of course, shifted to the east, but there were a few EU member states reminding people that the southern flank is also unstable and there will be problems in the south that will at some point require a degree of military attention. Now, of course, this is obvious with the war in Gaza. Not that I'm pleading for EU military intervention in Gaza, but you get the picture. I am slightly more skeptical, Johann, about the rapid deployment capacity, about the RDC. I think the level of ambition to be able to deploy 5,000 troops is the correct one if you want to make a significant impact in a crisis. That's usually the sort of number that you need, if I'm talking land-centric for a moment, but you are from the army here, so I can do that. But I'm thinking, if this is what we want, and if we want to be able to sustain such a deployment in more than one crisis, we do not need different smaller modules that together add up to 5,000. We need modules of 5,000 each, in a way, right? We need member states to say, I have a brigade of 5,000 that could be used for this type of operation. A pool of, let's say, 6 brigades, those brigades could do maneuvers together, and then if a crisis happened, chances would be bigger that if you have a pool of 6 member states whose brigades have already done maneuvers together, that you can generate a tailor-made force from that pool for the task at hand. If I say 6 times 5,000, 30,000, that's actually half the headline goal. Everybody forgets that the level of ambition officially of the EU is still the headline goal, 10 or 12 brigades or 60,000 troops. Political leadership in most states happily ignore that, but that's the fact. So in my view, a serious expeditionary force would be that level of ambition. I know it's very easy for me to declare that here as an academic, but I guess pontificating is my job, so to say. I see another issue there, which is linked to the NATO new force model, which also includes a sort of a NATO response force 2.0, which will be the Allied Response Force, or the ARF, which will also be an expeditionary force composed mostly of Europeans. And I wonder, will the Europeans have the numbers of troops of an expeditionary nature in the state of readiness to do both schemes? And the NATO scheme supposedly is a NATO-only scheme. So when your troops are on rotation for the ARF, in theory, we cannot use them for something else. Do we have the troops to do both at the same time? Does it make sense? I'm not so sure. The reality is, if you look at operations since the turn of the century, combat operations, or operations that involve the risk of combat, most of them have actually taken part outside the formal EU and NATO frameworks, but they have been done under national command or under command of a coalition of the willing. So however we organize it, RDC, ARF, we must build in the flexibility that allows the member states who are willing to go under whichever command structure, be it an ad hoc command structure. Third point then is the defense of Europe itself and deterrence, which is indeed very much linked to this NATO new force model. And I do realize, coming from the Austrian Netherlands, that I'm in Austria, and that is a difficult issue, but I think it's reality. I think in most capitals of EU member states, those that are also in NATO, the defense establishment's attention is almost fully absorbed by implementing the NATO new force model, the new iteration of the NATO defense planning process that started last summer. That is a reality. Even in Belgium, and we like to think of ourselves as one of the most enthusiastic about European defense, but that's what our defense staff is doing now. 99% of their time. Now, to understand it, it's linked to the grand strategy question. The way I understand this is a Europeanization of the conventional deterrence and defense in Europe. The Americans have basically said, since Obama, Asia is priority number 1. So we're still a priority, but priority number 2. So another prudent assumption, I think, would be to say that if ever there would be a war, let's say over Ukraine and over Taiwan simultaneously, the US might say, dear European friends, Taiwan first, but don't worry, once we've defeated China, we'll come and help you. So we have to hold the line in Europe, and the NATO new force model is that. As Johann, as you said, it's massively ambitious, 300,000 European troops in a high state of readiness. That is not something we're going to do in the next couple of years, but it is necessary. It means that under the American nuclear umbrella, you are building a conventional European posture that should be strong enough to deter or defend against any conventional threat to Europe, even if there were no single American soldier in Europe, conventional soldier. And it leads to all kinds of good old-fashioned Cold War type debates, right? Because the American nuclear umbrella is there, but of course it is not activated so easily, right? If hypothetically Russia sends a platoon into Estonia, we're not going to send a nuclear armed F-16 from Belgium to Moscow, clearly. So I say that to say the conventional first line of defense must be serious, and that is our responsibility. But I fully agree with Johann, there's a chance here to promote European defense cooperation. It's a bit of an irony because this is what ESDP and our CSDP has been about since 98, 1999, but we haven't really done it. I mean, I started working on this topic as a master's student back in 1998. It's by coincidence fully 25 years ago. I mean, that's totally insignificant fact, but it's nice for me. I mean, it kept me in business. I have a mortgage to pay. It's fine. But if you look at the achievements in terms of defense integration, it is close to zero, sadly. That we must be honest. It is close to zero. But now, in a way, the NATO new force model may force it, because what does it say? We'll divide the eastern flank into 3 sectors, north, middle, and south, not very original. Behind each sector should stand an army corps, and under these army corps you have divisions and brigades, all composed of Europeans. If we Europeans would coordinate our effort there and make sure that these are indeed complete and coherent corps, divisions, and brigades with our own European enablers, in other words, that they become a freestanding, or say a European package of forces that can stand on its own feet, right? Which is not now the case. If today you take only the armed forces of Europe, you do not have a complete set of armed forces. There are enormous gaps which only the Americans can fill. So if we remedy this, and in doing the NATO new force model, we make sure that the American force package, so to say, stands alongside the European package, but the European package on its own is also a complete and coherent set of forces, then we would have this mythical European pillar of NATO there, right? It's a concept that's often used, but like a European army, nobody really knows what it means. But if we would do this, we would have a European pillar of NATO in capability terms, not in political terms, not in some sort of European caucus within the NAC, but in pure capability terms. And I think that is what we need. And I would say use all the instruments that we have created, permanent structured cooperation, the European Defence Fund, and so on, use them also to that purpose, because that is, for the majority of member states, the priority. And if we do not use those instruments for what member states consider to be the priority, they will be forgotten and they will be marginalized. You know, I'm a great believer still in CSDP. You know, the good thing about, of course, of believing is that then you don't need evidence, because when you believe, you believe. But it is indeed hard to find evidence, right? So PESCO in particular, I'm very disappointed with it. I think so far it has failed. We're doing dozens and dozens of projects, but only a few of them have strategic significance. None of them is useless, but strategically significant, a handful. We could do so much more with that. And I mentioned PESCO because the Council decision says exactly that the aim of PESCO could be, not should be or is, but could be a comprehensive full spectrum force package. I think this notion of package is crucial. So to wrap it all up and say a bit about European grand strategy, we must indeed not forget this military component of it. I think the EU is developing a number of policies that go some way to defending its interests. There's the whole idea of open strategic autonomy in economic terms and de-risking, making sure economic sovereignty remains on track. There's the whole global gateway, which should allow us to have a positive story to tell, to gain influence in other countries. There's our still principled commitment to multilateral cooperation, but none of this will work if not underpinned by military force. And I think in the end it's a mindset, right? Do we see ourselves as a player, a main actor, in the same league as China, Russia, and the United States? And then we have to do all this. And we are maybe beginning to realize this, because now we know that if we claim to be a geopolitical union, then supporting a state at war like Ukraine, that's the sort of thing that a geopolitical player does. So is that how we see ourselves? But at least half of the member states don't see themselves. They see the EU as a secondary actor whose only role on the world stage is to be the most faithful ally of the United States. And as long as we don't get over this divide, we will always oscillate between the two. But if we want it, I think the resources are there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, Biscop. I think that was indeed also quite a deep dive into the challenges, but also the strategic ambitions from the military, from the security perspective. But thank you for elaborating on those. I'm sure that also in the audience, like in myself, I've made some notes, and we probably can also engage in a discussion with a couple of questions and answers. But first of all, let us introduce our third speaker, Vladimir Milov. Mr. Milov, you're also an expert when it comes to energy and economy, of course. And we have heard now more about the military, the hard power components of the European strategy, the challenges that those pose as well. Maybe in your elaborations we can focus a little bit also of the question, does these soft power approaches, especially the sanctions towards Russia, which impact did they have in the past? How did they play out?
Thank you very much, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but I'd like to thank my colleagues for having me here, and Minister Faslabend and friends. It's great to be back at the Diplomatic Academy and take part in this timely and thoughtful discussion. I'd like to begin with addressing these strategic challenges component a little bit, because when talking to many Western policymakers and experts, I'm struck how many of them still perceive Putin's war against Ukraine as just something bilateral that happens between Putin and Ukraine. It is not. And I think this is something which is underappreciated by the Western public in general. For instance, there's been an election campaign in Slovakia in the past few months, and I came there and talked to people who were participating in that, and I said to many of them, do you remember that 2 years ago, before invading Ukraine, Russia actually put forward a public set of what they call security guarantees, when one of the key demands was that all new NATO member states that have joined since 1997 actually cancel all troop and weapons deployments to the configuration that existed beforehand, before 1997. Means that, and it was exactly the same language that they used to justify Putin's aggression against Ukraine, meaning that Moscow currently does not consider all new NATO member states as fully sovereign. They believe that they can actually dictate what kind of defense and security policy these countries are about to choose. And this, as we know from the example of aggression against Ukraine, this is just a first step, a pretext for something bigger. Meaning that if the question is, if Russia somehow succeeds or considers its war against Ukraine successful, will it go further? From the declaration about security guarantees released 2 years ago, I think the clear answer is yes. Which means that when we discuss what is currently going on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, it's just not enough to have this narrow focus. We need to look further. we need to also follow some major efforts of Moscow, like look how much money they are investing right now to support anti-European, anti-Western parties in Moldova. Here's another example, and they have been openly mulling, I mean, very publicly, Russian government officials and pro-government experts, state propaganda, they have been openly mulling that that's probably the next target. The Baltic states, northern Kazakhstan, whatever. So I think it is important to understand that we have a strategic threat here coming not only from Putin's Russia, but in a broader sense, from a wide range of autocratic regimes who have major difficulties at home. Autocratic regimes cannot generate a successful future vision development model as an alternative to the Western way of life. Their own populations are deeply unhappy with what is going on. We can talk about it further, but I know how this happens in Russia, but you could have seen this in Iran and other places. So expansion is the only natural way for them to compensate for all the domestic failures, which means that if we look at China's economic slowdown at the moment, that, you know, bearing in mind my Russian experience, looks kind of threatening to me. Because China's economic downturn is systemic, there's no easy way out of that. They have to find a model to go further economically. How does Xi Jinping compensate for all these economic difficulties? Little victorious war, as usual. So I think that kind of elevates that threat. And another important issue is that all these autocratic regimes, they cooperate. They help each other in all these different ventures that they are into. Iranians and North Koreans are supplying weapons to Russia. Chinese not yet, but it's providing significant economic assistance. And Gaza militants in Hamas, if they were not backed by Iran, I think there would have been a great certainty that their assertiveness would be significantly lower than we have seen recently. So here are some strategic threats. It is not just, it should not be narrowed down to whatever issues there are between Russia and Ukraine. We should see it as a development of some global challenges to international rule-based order, which was also mentioned by colleagues. And it is important to look at whatever happens through that light, in exactly that kind of paradigm, in which case all that the colleagues have been talking about during this previous session becomes very relevant about strengthening defenses against these strategic challenges. The other thing which strikes me, and I think here is where Putin sees his lifeline, is a great degree of Western impatience. Oh, Ukrainian counteroffensive has been going on for 5 months and they still haven't achieved a breakthrough, which means it was all in vain. 5 months. I mean, Russia and Russian military, Russian economy, it has a lot of problems, but it still has a lot of strengths. 5 months in this regard, it's nothing. It's a beast, big beast to strangle, right? So patience is needed. I personally can tell you that our analysis shows that there is still significant potential for a Ukrainian breakthrough on a battlefield in the months to come. Because first, the manpower potential of the Russian military is getting significantly worn out. If you really look at whatever information comes there from the battlefield, troops are exhausted. There is zero rotation. Most potent and capable and combat-ready troops have been decimated. You really have a much more secondary class personnel fighting out there. So a little more patience and results can be achieved. With whatever skills Russians have developed during nearly 2 years of the war, yes, they do the heavy mining and fortifications. Yes, they use radio-electronic defense and air defenses pretty successfully. Yes, they have the air superiority, but troops on the ground, that's the weak part. So we have to exercise some patience here. Economy, another major issue. For those of you who are interested, I've just published an update at the Globsec website about the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Many people judge that in a primitive black and white sense. If the Russian economy still hasn't collapsed, it means that sanctions are not effective. It hasn't collapsed, but sanctions are having the profound effect, which is deepening over time. I just listened to the chairman of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who's been speaking in the State Duma, Russia's federal parliament, a few days ago. She says, we need a prolonged, lengthy period of extremely tight monetary policy to maintain control over inflation. Inflation is caused by ruble depreciation, which is caused by sanctions, because Russia cannot and will not be able to produce anything. It has to import from China, Turkey, and elsewhere. Sanctions have deprived Russia's ability to launch a major import substitution. They need international cooperation for that. They need component parts, technologies. Import substitution not working. Russia imports a lot. That puts pressure on the ruble. Ruble puts pressure on the inflation. Inflation causes extreme rate hikes, 15%. That's growth prohibitive. So sanctions do work, and I will not go into too much detail, but patience. Again, we're coming to the issue of, when we talk about strategic challenges, we need strategic patience. Russia is a big player. It still has a lot of resources, and Putin still has a lot of determination. Just look at his recently approved 3-year federal budget, which is not only envisaging significant increase of military spending for next year, but 2- or 3-fold increase of military spending for 3 years ahead, as compared to the level of 2021. That means it also comes at a huge price for the Russian economy, because it will be paid with significant increase of taxation, which will be another growth killer in pair with the central bank rate hikes. But Putin is determined, and he considers this as a long-term, lengthy fight. He is prepared. He is prepared to be patient. So if the democratic world does not want to lose this fight against Putin, who wants to redraw the international order, no less, it's not about Ukraine, it's about international order, then we need patience. And we need to understand also the weak sides, because there are plenty. The army is getting worn out by the day. The economic resources are getting worn out. Sanctions are working. But he still has a lot of capability, which means it takes time. I think the biggest security challenge, I was listening to colleagues, and I tend to agree with all that has been said about European defense capabilities. But I think the biggest issue is not the hard power. The biggest issue is understanding that we are in a protracted standoff with major global autocracies for redrawing the global order. That means if policymakers, if the societies don't have patience to fight for this order, to participate in a lengthy, protracted fight, then Putin wins. We should not afford it. That means patience is the key strategic resource that we should be counting upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much also to you, Vladimir Milov, and for reminding us of the key importance of patience. I do agree with that statement. And just to very quickly summarize the complexities that we have discussed now. We have talked about the momentum for security and defense policy in Europe, the positive developments that we can observe, especially vis-à-vis the rapid deployment capabilities until 2025, and also the support, the continuous support for Ukraine in the military realm. However, we can also say that all this is very much dependent on the political will that is becoming probably more fragile, also vis-à-vis the fact that we will have EU parliamentary elections next year, a fact that we haven't mentioned so far, but that could also change the political will and landscape within Europe to a factor that can determine the successful outcome of the facts that we have discussed in this momentum for security defense policy. And we have also heard from Sven Biscop that even though we have this positive development of 5,000 troops, probably this is also not enough in the long term, and that it is unclear how and if the future of European support for Ukraine will look like. And in addition, we have an increasing international authoritarian development, cooperation between authoritarian states that is putting more pressure, more strategic challenges and risks on the European Union on this global meta level. So this is why I'd like to start with one very clear and frank question to all of you. The same question, one statement, one key priority, keeping in mind these challenges that we have now discussed. What is, to your opinion, the most important key priority to overcoming these challenges for European security and defense policy? Just in 1 or 2 sentences. We will start again with you, Major General.
Can we give me one? Okay. No, it should work. Yeah. Yeah, very brief, to end strategic naivety.
In which sense exactly?
Yeah, and you wanted just one sentence?
One sentence, yeah.
Okay. No, so
I mean, you have 2 sentences now.
Okay, okay. That is, yeah. Of course, everything starts with reflecting, with thinking. So the first step is, of course, to recognize, yeah, to have a realistic picture of what the challenge is and ahead of us, and then, of course, start with strategic thinking. Defining European interests. Yeah, this is not so easy, but this is always the starting point for everything when it comes to defining victory in Ukraine, or when it comes to our military engagement in Western Africa. The starting point always should be what are the European interests, which we should implement, and then from that derive then comprehensive security strategies in order to implement them.
But to build up the understanding of interests and capabilities before
this will follow.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Milov, for
Unity.
your unity.
Unity does miracles, because Putin did not expect that the West would provide such a significant military aid to Ukraine. He thought that Europe is going to freeze in the winter without Russian gas. This is actually why he invaded. He underestimated the Western unity, European unity, so keep it.
Thank you. Also a very clear statement. Sven Biscop.
Maybe, and then to bring a bit debate into the panel, to read the world correctly. And I slightly disagree with the analysis of how the authoritarian regimes work together. Of course, to some extent they don't, but not fully. I think what we rather see is that each of these authoritarian regimes pursue the national interest. And for example, you see very clearly that China will not allow Russia to push it in a direction that it doesn't want to go, and that it carefully calibrates how far it goes, supporting Russia so that it doesn't lose it as a partner to counterbalance the US, but not to such an extent that it has to break with us. So I think the dynamics of world politics is not sort of democrats versus autocrats. I think it's states pursuing their interests. And yeah, some of the autocrats actually, we need them. Many of the autocrats are neutral on the specific issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we should be careful not to push them into that camp. So this calls for us for a more nuanced diplomacy. It also means that we have to push aside a bit this rhetoric that we always have of democracy versus autocracy, or abandon, I think, the unrealistic idea that the point of our foreign policy is to democratize the world. I would say the point of our foreign policy is to preserve our democracy.
Thank you very much. So if the European Union will be more nuanced in its diplomacy, will not be naive, and will most certainly remain united, then I believe that we have certainly a good mix of 3 components that will enhance also the opportunities for security and defense policy in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some time left, so we can also engage the audience in some questions. I see my colleague is coming already with the microphone. We will start here at the center in the second row with you, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for all of your very interesting inputs. My name is Ron Willis. I'm president of the Club of Commercial Councillors here in Austria. I'm a little bit concerned when I hear about plans of increasing the military production capacity in Europe over a space of 10 years, a decade. During World War II, the UK, and I'm not British by the way, but the UK had to double its aircraft production within about a year, months. It had to increase its shipping capacity to import about 1 million tons of supplies from the US per month. And we're talking about a plan spread over 10 years. Now you could say, okay, if we're really threatened, we might be able to do the same. But remember, the decision and the production increase of the three main allies in the war, the UK, US, and Canada primarily, in the end, after 3 or 4 years, had enough capacity to also give Russia 12,000 battle tanks and 18,000 aircraft. Now, you say we might be able to do the same, but there, in that time, only 3 countries had to make the decision. We have 30 countries here. Mm-hmm. What chance have we got? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Teresa Fallon, I think you also had a question, if I saw it correctly, that your hand was also up. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I have a question for Sven. You mentioned a more nuanced policy, but we see that at some point, Chinese analysts see that they've lost Europe, but they see it only for temporarily, because I think they can rebrand themselves after the war in Ukraine. Because right now, she is kind of handcuffed to a corpse in Putin, and they understand they have reputational damage, but they're willing to accept that, understand that they are losing Europe, but they see it only as a temporary situation, that they can woo them back if they help rebuild Ukraine, rebrand themselves as a peacemaker, and everything will be fine. So how does Europe respond to this? Because we see, we have red lines, Europe always says, but the evidence is growing that China is supporting Russia. First of all, of course, they buy oil, so they're bankrolling Putin's war in Ukraine. Second, a lot of the 70% of the equipment found on the battlefields of Ukraine, according to David O'Sullivan, the ambassador for sanctions, says it's coming from China. And then there's a new report that came out that the high-tech stuff is coming out of Hong Kong, and we don't know what's coming out of North Korea. If it's China sending stuff there, we have no idea. So I think the evidence is growing, but I don't know what the EU is going to do. I think my impression is they don't want to even go there. They don't even want to recognize this because that might make them take action.
Thank you very much, especially also for that sneak peek to the afternoon session where you'll be speaking exactly on these topics as well. Do we have one more question? Yes, Mr. Krachenberg, please.
I have a question concerning Hungary, maybe even Slovakia. If they are blocking more and more any decisions, common decisions, what is the alternative? The willing only? Is there a concept? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's keep it with these 3 questions, and with small remarks also from our speakers. We will have one more round of questions then afterwards, but I would like to ask the speakers to also keep it short. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think I take the first one, by the gentleman here. Of course, this many-year transformation process for the defense industry, of up to a decade, what I mentioned, was mentioned in the framework of a peacetime economy. If, of course, there would be the political and the public decision to change today from a peacetime to a wartime economy, then of course we would have different timescales. But in this case, we would not speak about 2% on defense, but about very, very different ratios. And I think we are far, far away from this discussion in Europe.
Sven, there was also a question directly related to your remarks before.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. I don't think China has. Well, let's look at it from the European interest. The EU is a global economic player, but a very export-dependent one, right? It is in our interest to maintain free trade and globalization, including with China. That's our interest. So it's not in our interest. So it is very much our interest to avoid a decoupling or a new Cold War if we can. China might provoke it itself at some point, or the US might provoke it. But my reading for the moment is that the Xi Jinping regime is very much focused on internal consolidation, the domestic economic challenges, but also rumblings within the party. My reading is not that their answer will be, let's create a war to divert the attention. I think it's rather the opposite, because the war they would start would be against Taiwan, which actually helps their economy. So why would they do that? But I do think, the mainstream thinking in Europe remains. It's better to work with China if they give us something to work with. But then we can discuss, is that really China's intention, right? I was there for the first time since COVID again last summer, and then we've also had since the summer some Chinese delegations. And my feeling is always the same, that our Chinese colleagues don't really understand how the debate in Europe has shifted. If there's a continuum from, to put it simple, from panda hugging to dragon slaying, that we've moved along. Not quite to the dragon slaying, but that the average European position is now more skeptical than it was, meaning that nice intentions and vague promises are no longer enough to re-dynamize the relationship. We need concrete action, and then we could re-dynamize the relationship. I have the feeling there's a strong debate about this within China at a certain layer. Does it reach the top and will it translate into Chinese policy? I don't know. But given what our interest is, I would say, as long as we think there is a chance we can work with China on certain issue, that should be our objective.
Thank you very much. Mr. Milov, would you also like to comment?
Yes. A very interesting debate about democracies versus autocracies. Definitely, you should not take my remarks as a need to launch a crusade against autocratic regimes. No. Yes, there is limited convergence between them, and the free world needs to exploit that. And there are cracks in this unity, which is very important. But 20 years ago, I also attended a lot of these debates. And largely, it was believed that Russia and China, with all this integration into globalization, benefiting economically, they will be just a bigger version of United Arab Emirates. Here we are now, 20 years down the road. I personally do not really think that there is a prevailing certainty that China would attack Taiwan. Moreover, after Putin's failures in Ukraine, they would probably think twice, 10 times before doing that. However, I remember what people said 20 years ago, all these papers wrote by think tanks in Washington, that next step China becomes democracy. Right? Seriously, you can download, all this exists, the papers never burned, right? So and here we are now, not only discussing the very possibility of China attacking Taiwan, but with a very specific need to spend a lot of money, very practical, pragmatic money to defend Taiwan, just in case. Whether China will attack or not, we don't know, but the threat is far more real now than it was 20 years ago. So we should see a pattern here, and I can tell you two things. As a guy who lived under autocracy more than half of my life, in Soviet Union and later under Putin. First, consolidation of power removes barriers. When you are constrained by public opinion and all of that sorts, you will think twice. If you don't have constraints, why not? Let's attack somebody. The second thing, again, there's a fundamental problem. We see a pattern here. Autocracies cannot deliver good well-being. The situation deteriorates. How do you compensate for that? Small victorious war. This is perpetual, which is why we should definitely no crusades. We should exploit the differences. We should also offer some incentives for autocracies who behave and obey international rule-based order, true, but we should see a pattern here if we're talking about strategic challenges.
We have the time for one last round of questions, and I think there are some questions over here to my left. but please, I'd like to ask everyone who is asking a question to just briefly introduce yourself and also keep the question very precise and very short. Please, the gentleman here in the third row.
Thank you very much. I have two short questions. So the first question is to Mr. Milov. So how do you evaluate the risk of disinformation in the election of European Parliament in next year and the presidential election in the United States in next year? And the second question is to Mr. Frank and to Mr. Biscop. So now you are talking about more or less about Europeanization of the European defense in continent. And my question is, how should be the relation between the Article 42.7 of European Union and Article 5 of the NATO? So I mean, should the 42 be invoked if NATO or USA does not engage as a whole? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's also a gentleman here in the second row. Yes, please.
My name is Andreas Krassel. I have two questions just briefly. The first one is for Mr. Frank. He had in his presentation a point where he said a new leadership might be required, and then there was stated a group of 5, but you didn't elaborate on that, so I would be interested on what you meant. Secondly, I want to echo the sentiment of Mr. Biscop, who said maybe we should be a little bit more hesitant to carry the democracy in every corner of the world, but maybe stressing the point on Africa. Europe wasn't really successful in that regard, but autocracies have been recently, especially in Sahel. What might be the reason for that, and how can the EU counter that?
Thank you. And very last question here from the lady in the fourth row. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aurora Weiss. I'm a journalist. So basically, my question would be a focus of the Mr. Frank, and it's about actually the defense of Europe and what is actually the strategy. We are not talking about like helping Europe to the Ukraine, then really correct like defense policy and defining borders of European Union. If we look at it, we have the Western Balkans, which is a soft belly inside the Europe. And until the people are focusing on Ukraine or Israel and Palestine conflict or China and Taiwan, we have from other side like the Bosnian, which is in the moment very, very, I would say like conflict area because the certain group inside Bosnia are actually arming themselves, and I'm completely thinking about like not about Mr. Dodik, like Mr. Schmidt told, then more on an Islamic movement that is coming from that side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to start, Mr. Milov, with you this time to elaborate on some of the questions that were also directed to you, but please also for your final remarks to sum up this discussion.
There was one question specifically directed to me about Russia's interference in elections. Definitely they would go for it, particularly in Europe. They have certain countries with like very strong pro-Russian and anti-NATO sentiment, like Slovakia and Bulgaria. Well, they would just unleash themselves. In others, they would operate depending on the practical possibility, but largely their goal would be to attack the mainstream political forces and to elevate all this anti-mainstream sentiment, which at the end of the day would as they hope, reduce Europe's strategic determination to confront Putin's regime. In the US, I think Americans are wary already of the Russian interference back in 2016, which means that there is far less room for them to do stuff, but they have already unleashed the big beast 7 years ago. So he's capable of doing the job by himself now, so no Russians needed as such.
Thank you. Sven, there were also two questions, if I remember correctly, directed to you, also the risk of disinformation, but also Africa, authoritarian versus democratic developments. Can you elaborate briefly?
Yeah. 2 points on this information. I can only echo you what you said, but on 42.7 Article 5, I think now, well, the reality will be that for quite a while to come, it will be Article 5 through NATO that we, in concrete terms, organize our defense, while 42.7 stays a strong expression of our political commitment. But it is legally binding. In that sense, we should not be forgetting about, in all the discussions about Ukraine, because there's sometimes still this idea out there that maybe Ukraine should not join NATO, but it should join the EU. But yeah, if you join the EU, 42.7 applies. And we would also be legally obliged to go to war to defend Ukraine. That's important. Now, on Africa and the Sahel, I'm not an expert on it. So in my defense, Egmont has a separate Africa program, so that's my colleague's job. But I think overall, towards our southern neighbors, we never really got the balance right between promoting our values and defending our interests. And we ended up often contradicting ourselves and undermining our credibility. Remember Romano Prodi's Ring of Friends, right? And in a way we still need that. We need a ring of friends around Europe, but our friends need not necessarily be as democratic as we. I think that's, so many years later, that's the conclusion, and we must work pragmatically towards it. But that's not a short-term solution, obviously, and unfortunately Russia has been very adept at playing into the local conditions of coups and counter-coups and civil war and turning key players against us. So we'll have to really think about what offer can we make economically, but also security. And in a way I find it interesting, as my last word, it is part of our unique selling proposition that we can offer security and defense cooperation to our southern neighbors. I mean, if you're an African government and you want military aid, combat troops, not me giving a lecture, but a combat battalion, whom do you call? You probably don't call the US, actually. The US will send you 3 guys from the CIA, but not a brigade of Marines. You don't call China because they may sell you weapons, but they will also not deploy combat troops. You can call Moscow, or you can call Paris/Brussels. So it should be part of our unique selling proposition also to offer military aid. And I would say if a country is important for the global gateway, it should be important for CSDP maybe. A lot of thinking is required.
Yeah, thank you very much. Major General Frank, please, your final remarks and also address some of the questions that have been directed, especially vis-a-vis 42.7 and Article 5.
Yeah, 42.7. I think if we look into the history books, it's interesting that, to my knowledge, Article 5 of NATO has never been invoked. Once? It was? 9/11. Yeah, the 9/11. Okay, so with this further interpretation. Okay, then it's 1-to-1 because 42.7 of EU was also, after the terror attacks in Paris, invoked for the first time. And the interesting aspect from the EU side was that with regard to the procedure, this is a different procedure between NATO and EU, because within the European Union, the attacked country, in this case it was France, was negotiating on a bilateral basis with each of the member states what type of support they need in order to overcome this situation. And there was no official role of EU institutions in organizing and coordinating this support. So it was bilateral arrangements between, and by the way, Austria supported at that time France by providing transport capacities with air transport, I think under the guidance of General Ségur at that time. So even Austria is a neutral country. It's legally possible to make our military assistance and support in case of 42.7 is invoked. I think that for the gentleman in the second row, there was the question with regard to one of the slides. It was was related to the leadership question. I had no time to explain it a little bit further, but of course within the club of 27, in future even maybe more, there is always also the question of who takes then the political leadership, especially when it comes to missions and operations. And if we look at the capacities, we see much more than 80% of military capacities within the European Union are provided by 5 member states. So this is more or less this, I think you know it, this is France, of course, this is Germany, this is Italy, this is Spain, and then the fifth is of course with regard to the potential it would be Poland. So, and of course if you have especially a more robust and more risky operation, you need definitely to have a framework nation which is coordinating the military response, and this was the reference to the 5 on the slides. And by the way, the treaty foresees a possibility, Article 44 of the Lisbon Treaty, that the European Union can task a group of member states to act on their behalf. So I think, especially when it comes to more robust, more risky operation, invoking this Article 44 is another option which is available and which could be, with regard to practical aspects, very relevant. For example, when it comes to evacuation operation in very risky environment, which has to take place at short notice, I think either a national operation or Article 44 operation would be the most relevant. And then was from the lady one question with regard to the Western Balkans and Bosnia. I think that we are very satisfied that the mandate for EUFOR was renewed in the UN Security Council beginning of November. So that we have our legal basis to continue, and the European Union, of course, will remain committed on the Western Balkans, especially with regard to the security situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there is no doubt that this will remain one of our strategic priorities in the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear excellencies, I think based on the excellent remarks and comments and presentations from our 3 wonderful speakers and the engagement for the audience, I can say that I have kept my first promise that this will be an interesting and very relevant discussion on EU's security and defense policy. So join me in giving a big round of applause to our 3 speakers.